The next talk is going to be by Dr. Ofir Levi from the School of Zoology, Faculty of Life Sciences, Tel Aviv University, about using computer simulation and experiments to predict biological impacts of climate change. What strikes me is the use of both computer simulation and experiments, which is basically theory and practice. So I'm sure you all know the difference between theory and practice. Theory is when nothing works, but you can explain exactly why. Now, practice is when everything works, but nobody knows why. Now, we combine theory and practice. Nothing works and nobody knows why. Please.
I hope this works. Yeah, okay. So yes, our work, if you see this digitized lizards, I work in the interface between real lizards and digitized animals or lizards. And yeah, we all know about climate change. Oops, sorry. So we all know about climate change and how Earth is getting warm. Until now, on average, yesterday we said like the climate of Earth is 15 degrees. And I guess by now it's like 15.7 maybe. So just on average it's 0.7, which is basically nothing if you compare 0.7 to the natural variation on Earth. A seasonal variation yesterday, for example, was much warmer than today. I don't know if you noticed. But you have to remember that it's not only the average temperature that is increasing and shifting, it's also the standard deviation, the variation of climate and weather. So if the variation is increasing, we are getting much more extreme events of, for example, of heat waves. This poor kid, for example, had to put like a really cool swimming suit in order to cool down from the heat wave. And of course, the heat is also affecting animals. We see animals climbing mountains, like species that used to be at lower elevations. It's getting too hot for them at this lower elevation, so we're starting to see them, to find them at higher elevations in mountains. And one of the big challenges right now in ecology and biology is to try to predict, okay, so what's going to happen to these animals in the future? And because we can go to space, we send stuff to Mars, we can go inside cells, inside DNA and everything, but we still can't go to the future, which is a little bit, it's good for me because I can have a career about, biological modeling. And one thing that we can do is to use our imagination, try to imagine how the future is going to look like to animals. And when we combine scientific data, scientific knowledge with imagination, it's not just imagination anymore. It's modeling. It's scientific modeling. One example of scientific modeling, and it's similar a little bit to what we do with animals, is flight simulators. Right? We have an airplane with specific characteristics. We have a pilot, and we have different environments, and we can see what will be the performance of the airplane and the pilot in different environments. And we can put pilots and airplanes in extreme conditions and see how they operate, which is something that we will never do in reality because we don't want to risk pilots and airplanes. For example, everybody who knows San Francisco during the summer knows that there's a constant fog, right? And for me, for example, last year I almost lost my connection because the airplane that was supposed to come from San Francisco didn't arrive because of strong fog. So if you want to simulate, for example, how an airplane will perform in different conditions, we can have like the environmental data, for example, San Francisco in the summer, and we can have like the physical data, like the and everything we know about the performance of the pilot, and we can run a simulation and predict what will be the performance of the airplane in different conditions. And the same thing is what I'm doing with animals. Similar thing, not exactly the same thing. So with animals, we can have a lot of environmental data, for example, past climate or future climate. And we can also take a lot of the things that we know about animals and put them inside a simulation. And given all this data, we can simulate what will be the performance of lizards at different conditions, for example, under past and future climates. And there's always a trade-off between how complex we want to to create our models and how simple we want them to be. If the models are too simple, for example, here on the left, this is a model of a tree. This model is too simple because we can't see the leaves. We can't even see the color of the leaves. So there's not a lot of information here about the tree. And on the other hand, if the model is too detailed, maybe it's too detailed for us to really understand the patterns and the important things that we want to know about the tree. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is about the environmental data. How complicated we want the environmental data to be when we try to predict the impacts of climate change on animals. And also want to show you some experiments and how complicated we can get the models of animals to be, if we want to really understand what's going to happen in the future. So talking about environmental data, I want you to see the big mismatch between the climate data that we have and the resolution that is really important for animals. So here every row here in this graph is a different model, and this is the length in meters of the organism length and the grid length of the climate data. And you can see the big mismatch when people modeled the impact of climate change on animals between the organismal length and the actual climate data that they used. Because animals, what they see is the climate on the local scale, is the microclimates, right? If the animal is under the tree, it will feel the microclimate here. If it's in the bush, it's a different climate. If it's in the open, it's a different climate. All these kinds of climates are really important for animals. And what we mostly have when we download climate data from online databases, for example, is the 2 meters temperature. And I don't know any animal that live constantly in 2 meters. Well, and if you look at soil data, we see that the resolution of soil data is pretty low. And animals, insects and other animals, they live at, they can change their behavior and their location at centimeters and not at meters. Oops. So what we need is higher resolution data at centimeters resolution above and below the ground. And we need such data in the open habitat and in the shade habitat and in between habitats. Because animals, they move between these locations. And so it might be important for us to know what are the microclimates at these locations. Another problem with the environmental data is that it's mostly average data over months. And of course, animals don't feel the average monthly resolution data. And what happens when we use monthly resolution data is that we use the extremes. We use a lot of information about the data. If you look at all these weddings, for example, each couple in this wedding designed a different kind of ceremony. The dress is different, the haircut is different, the flowers are different. They really thought about the little details of their wedding. But look what happens when you do the average. Lots of data, lots of information in the data is gone. I mean, we can still see that the groom is wearing black and the bride's wearing white. The groom is a little bit higher than the bride on average, but a lot of data is lost. If you look at temperature data, it's the same. If you look at annual resolution data, it's constant. If you look at monthly resolution of minimum and maximum resolution, every day is the same. But if you look at hourly resolution, see what you get. You get all the extremes. And these extremes might be really very important for animals. So what I did, because I couldn't find hourly resolution data for past and future climate, I actually had to run computer simulations to downscale the data from high resolution from low resolution to high resolution. So I'll download community Earth system model results which was 6 hourly resolution and 120 kilometers. And I ran the WRF model, and I saved the results of the WRF model in hourly resolution data. And then I ran a microclimate model to calculate all the different microclimates, the temperatures of the different microclimates in the open and in the shade at hourly resolution. And what I got is a lot of data. We have 11,000 coordinates, different shade conditions, and different layers of temperature at 3 centimeter resolution above and below the ground. And it's actually 2 terabytes of data. So instead of working with gigabytes, we are now turning to terabytes of data when we work with climate data. Let's see if this is actually important. If we want monthly resolution versus hourly resolution data, let's look at heat events, for example. Here we see monthly resolution data. You can see the jumps in the events per year. And this is for the past climate, and this is the change by 2100. And you can see that there is a change, right? But you can see that the jumps, because if a month has an extreme event, this extreme event will repeat every day of the month because of the monthly resolution. If you look at hourly resolution, first you don't see the weird jumps anymore, and you can see that more areas are covered with extreme heat events. If you look at the shade with the monthly resolution data, there's almost no events, not now and not in the future. But if we use hourly resolution data, you can see, wow, you can see a lot of areas are going to experience these extreme heat events. And this might be very important for animals. So let's look about the animals now. Let's look about the lizards and how we use experiments together with the hourly resolution data to try to see how future climate is going to affect these animals. So lizards, they have a life cycle, right? You can start with the adult, and the adult has to lay eggs. The eggs, if the climate is right, they develop into juveniles, and the juveniles need to grow and become adults. And usually what people do, they study the adult lizards. Why? Because it's easy to find them in the field. You can take them to the lab, do experiments. And so let's start with the adult and see what's going to happen maybe in the future. So to simulate what happens to lizards, to adult lizards in the future, we use what we call biophysical niche model. Basically, you have a lizard and a climate, and you can simulate the body temperature of a lizard. And if the temperature is right, the lizard can go outside and forage and digest food. And then it can use the energy from the digestion and for growth and reproduction. So in places where climate is right for many times, it means that lizards are going to have more time for foraging and digestion. And it means that they can grow and reproduce more. So what's the big deal about body temperature anyway? So lizards are ectotherms, and the body temperature change with the climate. And you can see that the performance of lizards really depends on their body temperature. And it's on the maximum only at a small range of temperatures. And when you go outside and you catch lizards that are active and measure their body temperature, you'll see that they really keep their body temperature at a small range of temperatures. We can take all this data and put it in a simulation. And you can see in this picture that the body temperature of lizards is not the air temperature. Right? You can see the big difference here. The air temperature is 25 degrees, and the lizard temperature is 35 degrees. This is the lizards in a real picture. And the same process that happens to the lizard when it goes outside, it's the same process that happens to your car. It's basically a heat balance. And you can use physics to calculate the body temperature, like you calculate the body temperature of the temperature of a car, you can calculate the body temperature of a lizard. But you need a lot of information. You need a lot of climate information, solar radiation, wind speed, etc., and a lot of physical knowledge about lizards. And all these things you need to put in a computer simulation and calculate the body temperature of a lizard. And what's cool about the adult lizards is that they can move. right? They thermoregulate all the time. Remember what I said? When you catch a lizard in the field, it's always going to have almost the same body temperature. That's because they thermoregulate. If it's too hot, they go to the shade. If it's too cold, they will go to the sun and get the solar radiation from the sun in order to heat their body. And you can also put that in the model as well. And so I built a simulation. I used the Scoloporus species complex as the lizard in the simulation, because that's a great lizard to simulate, because we have a lot of things that we know about these lizards, about the physiology of these lizards, about the ecology of these lizards. And it also lives in a large range of North America, and you can see that there are lots of climate conditions. So the hypothesis was that the adults can actually escape the warming because they can thermoregulate. And so let's see what's going to happen in the future. Because they can thermoregulate, it means that they can actually escape the heat, and you can see that the change by 2080, the change in the future, they actually can get more energy from the environment. Okay, this is the energy from energy per year for the past climate. You can see that there's a nice gradient between warm locations and cold locations. Here, red means that they can get more energy from the environment, and blue means that they can get less energy from the environment. And in the future, because they can thermoregulate so well, they can just stay in the shade at the warm hours and just forage in the shade. So they can be active and get energy from the environment, and they can actually increase the amount of energy that they gain from the environment every year. So it means that they actually won the lottery under future climate, right? But we have to remember that the adult lizards are not the whole story, because we still have the embryos to take into account. Now, the embryos are a different story, and even though they can bring more eggs because they have more energy every year, we still need to check what's going to happen to the embryos. So the embryos are actually inside eggs, and the eggs are in the ground once the female lay their eggs, so they can't thermoregulate, right? And they're actually more sensitive than the adults to thermal conditions. So the hypothesis is that when you take into account the embryos are actually at higher risk of death under climate change, because they can't thermoregulate, so they can't escape the extreme heat events. But we didn't know much about how embryos can tolerate different temperatures, so I actually had to do the experiment and go out to the field, collect the gravid lizards, take them to the lab, wait for them to lay their eggs, and do the experiments. So we went to different locations in the United States, New Jersey, Colorado, Arizona, and South Carolina. And lizards there actually experience different climates. And we experienced different embryos to 4 different thermal cycles with 4 different maximum temperatures. And what we saw is that and we actually we wanted to see if they survived or not. And how do you know if an embryo inside an egg survived? You can measure the heart rate. Right? So we bought small heart rate machines where you can put an egg and see whether there is a heart rate or not. And what we saw is that for all of the populations, embryos survived almost all of the conditions unless the temperature reached 44 degrees. So one exposure to 44 degrees killed all the embryos for all of the populations. So we can actually take this information and put it back in the model. And this is where the experiments and the simulations combine. Because you can't just have the simulation and you can't just have the experiment. You can connect them together and see what happens to your simulation. So let's look a little bit about the little soil temperatures at 6 degrees, at 6 centimeters. 6 centimeters depth is where the lizards usually lay their eggs in the field. And you can see that the days per year, in terms where the number of days where with little soil temperatures, it's not a lot. But if you look at the future, it's going to increase both in the frequency and both in the location. So lots of areas in the United States are going to be at risk. Once you can take the survival of embryos and the amount of energy that adults can get from the environment, and then combine it to one variable that we call population grades, like how many lizards are going to be added to our population every year. And this is the population growth rates that we got from the model for the past climate, with and without the embryos. And you can see that there's a nice increase from cold locations to warm locations. The gradient doesn't look so good when you add the embryos. However, when you look at the future, you can see that the result is actually the opposite. So if you don't include the embryos in the model, you see that there's a positive increase in growth rate under future conditions. But once you include the embryos, these little embryos that can't thermoregulate and they must stay inside the eggs, the results are actually getting opposite. So lots of locations in the United States, the lizards are going to be at risk. And we couldn't know that without taking the embryos into account. So this is why it's very important to look at the simulation, try to figure out, okay, what do I need to add to the simulation? What kind of experiment I need to do in order to better understand the impact of future climate. Another thing that the model gave us is a new hypothesis. So the model suggests that if lizards can actually lay their eggs in shadier nests, they can actually save lots of the embryos. And if they can lay their eggs in maybe deeper nests, they can actually not only save the embryos, but can actually increase the population growth rates under future conditions. And we didn't think about the hypothesis, but once we had it, we said, okay, let's do an experiment. Maybe lizards are smart. Maybe the females can feel if the temperature is a little bit warmer and change the nesting behavior. So we did an experiment, another experiment. In Arizona State University, we created all these enclosures with different shade conditions. And we collected females in the field, and we exposed them to, some of the females we exposed to hot conditions, and some of the females to optimum conditions. And we didn't find a significant change in the behavior of the females. And there's a lot of variation, but there was no significant effect of the treatment. We actually find an opposite pattern to what we thought that will happen. So in days where the minimum surface temperature was higher, they actually laid their eggs at shallower nests. And what's interesting about these lizards is that they didn't come from a desert. So it might be that lizards from desert will actually be smarter and feel that the egg is warm and will change their behavior. So what we got from the model is that maybe the lizards can lay more eggs, but lots of the eggs are going to get killed from heat events. Yeah, so I told you about the environmental data, how we used computer simulation to increase the resolution of the environmental data, and why this is important for animals. And I told you about why experiments are also important when we try to figure out the impact of climate change on animals. And the next project is actually to walk here in the desert, in the Dead Sea area, and try to find how lizards nest in the desert, where they lay their eggs in the desert. And the hypothesis is that the nesting behavior of desert lizards is actually going to be adapted to these warm conditions. So we're going to track the Sinai agama lizard soon in a month or so. We're going to find them and put radio transmitters on them and track them and see where they lay their eggs. And once we'll know where they lay their eggs, we can use a macroclimate model to try to figure out whether the nesting behavior is adapted to extreme warm conditions, and then see whether how climate change may impact the survival of their embryos. And I want to thank my collaborators and the fellowship that I got that helped me. And I want to thank, of course, Tel Aviv University, the Porter Foundation, and the Research Center here. Thank you. Sorry.
Aren't you making a kind of assumption, almost a Lamarckian kind of evolution versus a Darwinian evolution? I mean, wouldn't you suggest that the lizards that will survive because of environmental selection will be those that have accidentally or inadvertently or behaviorally laid their eggs at greater depth or have done it in shade, and that by a process that will go on over generations in a natural selection mode, those are the organisms that will have more offspring and they'll survive. But experimentally, you'll never see this because it will be in the noise of your data collection. Am I mistaken, or are you thinking about this?
I think you're right. It's not that I don't think that natural selection can act here. The question that you could ask in a small project is maybe they're just smart. Maybe they can feel it and lay their eggs at a deeper nest. And this is a question that we said, okay, let's try and see. And the answer was no. But so the other escape path, as you suggest, is natural selection, right? They have variation, and maybe this variation can save them.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.